There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
It is my pleasure to welcome a brand new guest to Bite Size Book Chats. This is Bunthivy from New Brunswick. Welcome, Bunthivy.
Hi, thank you for having me, Sean.
It's great to meet you. And you and I connected. I connected with you. I don't remember who followed who first on Instagram, but we are Instagram friends. And I saw that you were reading a memoir that's quite newly released that I was interested in. I have a copy. I haven't read it. It's called Ma and Me by Putsata Reang. And it's about a mother-daughter relationship. I'm not sure if the story stays in Cambodia, but it starts in Cambodia. And you have recently finished it, and I think you quite enjoyed it. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I read another memoir called First They Killed My Father, and I was following the author to that, and she had highly recommended Ma and Me by this new author, Putsata Reang, which is also a memoir on her experience fleeing the war in Cambodia and then basically growing up. In the description, she talked about this story that within their family, like when they fled Cambodia, they were on a boat and she was just a little over a year old, and in her just kind of this looks like a lifeless body in her mother's arm. And they've been on the water overseas for quite some time. I can't remember if it was 2 weeks or more, but the captain basically telling her mother, thinking that she's dead or close to dead, to just throw her overboard, just so, a dead corpse couldn't affect or impact other refugees on the boat that's overcrowded. And her mother fought fiercely to say no, she will not throw her overboard, and insisted on keeping her. And when they landed, rushed her to the nearest medicine or doctor set up tent there, and were able to revive her and get her the nutrition that she needed. And I guess the story kind of follows from that notion of survivor's guilt and the debt that you owe a person. Ways like, you saved my life. How does one become, indebted to that afterwards? It really talks about love and identity. She really explores the concept of belonging in this book, and her struggles with that struggle of being Cambodian and being American and trying to grow up and navigate between the two cultures, because you're never fully one or the other, or you're always feeling on the outside of the other. And then on top of that, struggling with her, being someone who came out in her 20s and then continues to come out, it seems, throughout the book, because in a lot of ways, especially when in a culture that is a lot more conservative, the idea of coming out for her and to her parents and to her mother especially was just difficult. She struggles so much with that. And she really explored how it impacted their relationships throughout and what it meant to own her identity and how that changed the dynamics of their relationships. And it was just beautifully crafted, incredibly crafted in how she navigated all of that, her teenhood all the way to her 40s. And it's just a remarkable story.
So when you say she came out, I believe from what I've read about the book that she came out as a lesbian, right?
At one point, she came out as bisexual to make it feel less hard on her mother. But right. I think, and she went through different relationships between men and women, but she fell in love with a woman towards the end and ended up marrying her. And I think that kind of really broke their bond, like in how she described it. Yeah, it was just such a mosh of, I mean, when you think about teen angst and growing up and just dealing with the typical stuff, and then to add on all those other layers.
And the mother and daughter, Ma and the author, Putsata Reang, had some difficulty dealing with the whole coming out thing. And you started talking about the book by telling us that Putsata felt a real debt of gratitude to her mother. And from what I've heard about this story is that her mother had very high expectations, that the debt of the gratitude was not enough, that the mother had fairly rigorous expectations of her daughter that caused some trouble.
Yeah, I mean, with all parents, they usually do have some kind of hopes and dreams for their kids. I think in a lot of ways, her parents probably also struggled with maintaining their cultural identity as well. And part of that is in how they raised their children. I think she was one of, let's say, 3 or 4 kids. But and I remember one of the things that kept coming up was her mom wanting any of her children to at least marry another Cambodian person in order to maintain some of those cultural heritage. And of course, everyone eventually married off to non-Cambodians.
I love the opening. There is a saying in Khmer, the language that left me in my youth, but links me to a land across seas, because it plinks off my mother's tongue. I'm not going to do very well with the Khmer phrase, Jo Duk Kapur Loring Lor Kla, which translates to, go in the water, there's the crocodile. Come up on land, there's the tiger. And then there's the cover image. It's a powerful opening, and I'm imagining that saying kind of sets a tone for the other things that are written about in the book.
Yeah, it was, she kind of weaves a lot of the stories throughout, like some of the stories that her mother would tell her, like folk tales from Cambodian and stuff. And usually there's stories that have some kind of lesson. Like I myself, my family also fled the war, and I came to Canada when I was about 4 years old. So we kind of landed on the East Coast, and it's rare to find stories that kind of unpackage that experience for you. So, and to find one from another Cambodian person, like I was just drawn to it from the beginning, just being able to read another first person account and how they were able to navigate.
Well, it sounds fascinating. I was already interested in the book. I bought the book. And then now that you've told me more about it, I'm all the more interested in getting to it. Thanks for telling us about it, Bunthivy.
You're welcome.
What an absolute delight to have Bob the Bookerer on Bite Size Book Chats, his debut appearance. Hello, Bob.
Hello. How you doing, Sean?
Great. So we are here to talk about the queerest of queer biographies. You just finished it the other day and gave it 5 stars. Valentine, Ackland, A Transgressive Life by Francis Bingham.
There we go. As modelled. There we go.
That's fabulous. And tell us about this book.
Yeah, I read this sort of because it was sort of shortlisted for the Polari Prize, and I'm reading through the shortlists for those. And the Polari Prize focuses on LGBTQ plus writing, particularly I think from sort of UK authors, or at least sort of the prize is based in the UK. And I knew nothing about this kind of going in. I hadn't heard of Francis Bingham, the writer. I hadn't heard of who the biography was about, Valentine Ackland. And so it was kind of a lot of going in with no real knowledge before. But yeah, a really, really beautiful biography. I don't often read too many biographies, just partly because, I don't know, they don't really necessarily come up too much, but I do want to read more. And This is just all about Valentine Ackland, who was a poet who sort of died right at the end of the 60s. But in all of her life leading up to it had been this sort of not really underground poet, but a poet who'd never really fully taken off, but had been in a relationship with Sylvia Townsend Warner, who was a more known poet. And so as a result, there's this sort of, this lesbian couple who are both poets, who are both, part of this literary scene, but are also incredibly private. And it's also at a time where to be outwardly queer would be, would have massive repercussions for them. So their life is this sort of really interesting, a real act of bravery and resistance, but also there's this sort of quiet beauty to a lot of what they're doing. So I just found this stunning as a biography.
I'm curious about the subtitle, A Transgressive Life.
Yes.
Please riff a little more on the transgressiveness of Valentine.
Yeah. So Valentine is interesting as well with her name. This is sort of a bit of a pen name as well to some degree. And she quite enjoyed the fact that Valentine or Valentine or however could be read as a male name or a female name. And so often she would sort of pass under the radar because people might pick up her collection of poems and think it was a man writing, and therefore kind of almost like George Eliot or kind of other writers who have used a male pseudonym kind of flew under the radar a little bit and avoided detection. And that also helped with she published the collection of poems together with Sylvia Townsend Warner, and so it almost looks like it could be a heterosexual couple, sort of, to anybody looking outwards. And that collection of poetry, that the poems are not named for who wrote them. So they basically almost these sets of poems kind of interweaving all the way throughout the book and kind of responding to each other. And so her transgressive life was kind of the fact that outwardly she was sometimes seen as a man in terms of having this sort of ambiguous name, but also she often wore sort of traditional male clothing. She often wore trousers or sort of waistcoats or things like that. And the biography is full of pictures of her, and had sort of more of a kind of, occasionally adopted more of a butch or masculine aesthetic. And so really pushed at the edges of that. But it's interesting because often when you get those characters in history, there's this sort of almost flamboyance, or like really, it's very outward facing of sort of a, hey, look at me, I'm wearing this thing. This is sort of daring you to kind of ask more questions. But actually her life was incredibly private. So she just sort of did that. And it wasn't often a big statement externally to other people. It was often just entirely how she felt. And sort of, she seemed to enjoy the playfulness of being able to dress like that.
We'll put some pictures up as we're talking that will go on the screen about showing her with Sylvia Townsend Warner. She was quite a political person as well. Is there much about her politics in the biography?
There is a bit, yeah. So there's a sort of a few mentions of had a bit of a streak of being quite communist, and that being a really big part. And particularly a lot of, her early writing was sort of just as she was sort of taking off. The war was World War II was happening, and sort of post World War II, her politics started really being shaped by that, and particularly sort of more leaning towards communism. But that also made her even more of this sort of outcast to so many people, because she is this, a woman dressed in sort of trousers and a tuxedo, who is writing these poems about loving women, who is a communist, who later sort of rediscovers her Catholicism. She had a lot going on. And so she's this figure that's really hard to grasp. And I think what I really loved about the biography as well is that Frances Bingham herself is, you can see her almost trying to reach and be like, what was really happening here? Particularly the later part of Valentine's life, where she starts having sort of a bit of a breakdown. There's this sort of real tragedy to it, but there's something so poignant in just sort of how, the life that she created also means that she's got people around her at the end of her life as well. So this sort of really interesting and kind of nuanced and complex figure of somebody who is at times very kind of private and does her own thing, and at times is just outspoken person about kind of communism or about politics or about whatever else. So she's just this really exciting figure.
Sounds like that the biographer has managed to capture what trendy people recently describe as moments of queer joy.
Yes. And I think that's actually the really lovely thing here. There's a lot of queer joy, also incredibly messy relationship triangles for large parts of our life. But
Yes, yes.
there are these moments where, there's sort of Frances Bingham, the biographer, sort of mentions a couple of times that had an agent as an author, had she been sort of taken up by a big publisher, had she lived in London and been part of literary circles or kind of part of this sort of elite, she would have been this huge author who we would hold in this kind of reverence, or we would know maybe as much as we do some other sort of big authors from her time. But instead, there's this kind of quiet figure, and instead, because of that privacy, there are these moments where she just gets to have these long summers with Sylvia Townsend Warner and have this beautiful life, or where she, we kind of get these moments of sort of Sylvia sort of swimming in the little river or lake near their house, near where they are, and but also she at one point takes another lover, which is a contentious thing with her and Sylvia, and just all of these things where she's so clearly trying to work out who she is and feeling these intense bursts of emotion of, being in love or having all this joy. And so I was just really enraptured by just what a complex life she had. It was never really a single or simple sort of trajectory through everything.
Is her poetry in the biography, or have you read any of her poetry or any of her other works?
It is actually. So I think Frances Bingham, if I'm right, was also a big part of having her poems come back to some degree, and she was finally acknowledged by sort of various literary bodies and everything a bit later. But there are moments where you get her poems in the book, and I mean, they're gorgeous poems often. Particularly, I think the skill of Frances Bingham in this book is setting up the kind of the personal history of Valentine and what she might be feeling in a single moment of, we're not just talking the later part of 1938 she was suffering. It will be this summer's day in 1938 she was really struggling, and here's when she wrote this poem, and we have the poem that we sort of see, or we Frances Bingham will say something along the lines of, these lines have sort of been changed, or these notes were left, and so we get to read these poems, and some of them are just gorgeous. There's a real sort of path that we follow in the book, because we get to sort of see the earlier poems, which are these sort of lighter poems, maybe trying to work out who she is, and we get these later life poems that are full of this sense of loss, or of there's a heaviness to them that kind of only really comes, I think, with sort of later years of sort of having seen things and knowing yourself a bit better. So it's gorgeous. I mean, I found it really moving, which I was not expecting. I picked it up from the library and I was like, oh, okay, it's about 300 pages. It's about a biography of somebody I've never heard of. And then just as I was going, I was just really brought into this world.
This is a book that I'm going to be getting to very soon. Thanks for telling us about it, Bob.
My pleasure. Thank you.
What a treat it is to have Kezia from Ohio joining us again. Hello, Kezia.
Hi, Sean.
And you have read a book by a writer of great interest to me. I have read 2 books so far, and one was my best book of that reading year, and the other one I was quite disappointed by. So I need you to break the tie for me, Kezia. You have read Akwaeke Emezi's latest novel, You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty, which I think is one of the best titles I've ever heard for a book.
Yeah, that definitely drew me.
Tell us about it.
All right, so this book was quite unpredictable in many ways, but very fun, very exciting, and still had this aura of sadness to it. So it's pretty interesting. So we're introduced to Faye, and it starts out like with a bang. Faye is already making some reckless decisions, and then we start to realize that, there's a reason why she's making those decisions, and that is due to her grief. Her husband died some years back, and she's still grieving, her love of life. Yeah. So she's also an artist, which plays a big role. She meets someone, fast forward, and the person takes her to a whole different place for her to explore her art. But she's still making a little bit of reckless decisions, and still grieving. So a lot of that plays into what all that's going to happen there. Yeah.
Yeah, well, here I do have a question. So this
Yeah.
new relationship that she gets into, does it start rather steamily on a rooftop?
Okay, no, okay. That was a reckless thing with the first thing. It actually ends really quickly. It was barely a relationship.
Oh, I see. Okay, I see that in the synopsis. So,
Mm,
how old is Faye at the opening of the story as somebody who's had grief from a husband who died a long time ago? Is she a middle-aged woman or older or younger?
that's a good question. I know she's either in her late 20s or early 30s.
Barely middle-aged. She's not even really middle-aged. Okay.
Yeah.
And I see in the synopsis that the accident that killed her husband was 5 years before the opening of the story.
Oh, cool.
And is the story set where is the story set? Nigeria?
No, it's actually set. She is Nigerian, but it's set in America.
She is Nigerian American.
Yeah. Her best friend is Ghanaian, so there is this African background. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. The African experience living in America. So far, you haven't mentioned anything that's gender bending. Is there anything transgender or African spirituality in this book? Because Freshwater was very much had those themes in a big way. How about this book?
Interesting. This is my first book, so it's interesting that you say that because this book was really super light, actually just more fun. Well, except the grief part, it wasn't light, but it was still really fun, super more nothing spiritual wise, and no transgender. So
in Freshwater, they wrote a lot about transgender experiences and really deep African spirituality issues. They have quite a wide variety of books they're putting out into the world then.
yes, yeah, I should brush up on them.
You might enjoy reading more of their stuff. Yeah. I love Freshwater. It was their debut, and it was my top read of whatever year it came out. And then I read their second novel was
The Death of something, Vivek
The
Oji.
Death of Vivek Oji, and I thought that was almost a complete failure for me, although lots of my friends thought it was quite fine. But and I have a book of their poetry that a friend just gave me that I've read a couple poems out of it, and it looks pretty good. So they are hit and miss for me. This one sounds really interesting. So what can you tell us about the title?
It's interesting because I still don't know what they meant when they wrote that title. I wonder if it has something to do with Faye's husband, because her art is very influenced by her grief. There's actually a scene, and it's not really much of a spoiler, but one of her art is described in very nice detail, about how the accidents can be explored through that art. So I truly don't know what they actually meant by title.
Well, I guess in a way it makes sense, but the death part makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Made a fool of death with your beauty, and there is some sexuality, some steamy sexuality, at least in one particular rooftop scene, and a new relationship with all the erotic stuff that would bring. Or I guess you wouldn't even necessarily have to say erotic, but just, you usually are attracted to someone who is beautiful to you. So, but it is a really intriguing title, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It really is.
Thanks so much for telling us about You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty, Kezia.
Thank you.
Well, how lovely to have Annie from Utah back. And Annie is not only from Utah, she's from the wonderful book blog, A Bookish Type. Welcome back, Annie.
Thank you for having me back.
We are here to talk about a work of nonfiction that I was quite interested to see on Annie's blog. If I didn't mention it before, I know I did. I'm just being silly, but the name of the blog is A Bookish Type. It's called The Seed Detective, Uncovering the Secret History of Remarkable Vegetables by Adam Alexander.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about this book.
This book is a collection of interesting facts and stories and experiments in his garden by Adam Alexander. And this is Ari making his debut. Alexander travels the world working on documentaries, and he started by going to farmers markets and finding people who had heritage variety seeds. And so it's a collection of his stories while he tries to track down the oldest seeds that he can find that are still being sold in marketplaces, taking them back to England. I actually looked him up later, and he has a garden in Monmouthshire, I believe. You can actually find him online, and in my blog post, I've linked to his garden. But he tries to grow them. The stories came from those travels, but also his own curiosity about how did what ends up on our plate come to get there. So for me, the most interesting parts of the book were where the words came from, because I love tracking down the names of things, because I think you can learn so much about our history by looking at our words, but also how we went from these things that if you find their ancestral version in the wild are very unappetizing, or sometimes toxic, or sometimes just not worth the effort. Like the ancestral version of corn, they think is a plant called teosinte, which grows in Mesoamerica, and it looks sort of like a tiny ear of corn. It's green. There's very few things on it. And then you compare that to the giant ears of corn that I remember from visiting family in Wisconsin that are like as big as your head and then some. So it's kind of a mishmash that way.
And I believe he got started on this quest, according to the synopsis, by a particular type of vegetable he encountered in Ukraine.
A pepper.
A pepper. Tell us about the pepper.
Yeah, so one of the kinds of plants that he collects, he seems to focus mostly on vegetables, so tomatoes, corn, beans, peas, and peppers. And I think tomatoes, if I didn't already mention it. But he was in a market in Ukraine while he was working on his documentary stuff, and he found a woman selling these peppers that he had never seen before. And when he tried one, he loved it. And he went after the seed. So he bugged the woman. He had his translator try and say, I want the seeds. And the woman's like, are you nuts? You've got the pepper right there. He ended up tracking that down. And that was one of the first times that he ever went after seeds. And now he works with seed libraries in England to refresh their stock and add things to it. And it came from eating a pepper that he loved in a market in Ukraine.
And did he successfully grow that pepper in his Monmouthshire garden?
Yeah, I'm really impressed by the amount of things that he was able to grow, because he's gone around the world, and one of the plants that he goes after is Hopi blue corn, which is grown in the Four Corners region of the United States. And I live in one of the Four Corners states. I know how dry and hot and then cold it can be. And there he is in Monmouthshire. And I've never been to England, but I understand that it's very rainy, very green, not a whole lot of extremes of climate. So he somehow finds a way to make these plants grow, either using like a cold frame or some other gardening techniques and things like that. But he's able to get these things to grow, including that Ukrainian pepper.
And are you a gardener?
I wish I was, honestly. I grow drought-resistant plants as much as possible in my garden. I don't grow vegetables, but I do grow sages, and I grow sunflowers and things like that. So it's more of a pollinator garden than anything else. And I was also impressed by Alexander's ability to do all of these things and nurse these plants to life when I'm more of a benign neglect kind of person myself. So it was really interesting.
And you're a person who eats vegetables, so that was probably more of the ways that you could relate to it. But it sounds like all the different aspects of it were intriguing. Obviously, written for the layperson. It's not an academic book. It's a popular work of popular
nonfiction. It is very conversational. I felt like I was sitting down with him at a pub somewhere and listening to him talk about his garden. There are times when he gets a little bit into the weeds of like the Latin names of things, but he always immediately explains everything he just said. So he'll actually explain what some of these Latin words mean. And he'll talk about the Scoville scale, which is used to rank the hotness of peppers based on the presence of capsicum within the pepper. So there is a science behind it, but also they have contests where people will try to eat the peppers that are at the highest at the scale. And I don't know how they do that, honestly.
What's your favorite vegetable?
Yeah, that one's tricky because I love tomatoes, but I know botanically they're not actually a vegetable.
All right.
Weirdly enough, I'm a big fan of broccoli.
Well, I love broccoli,
Mhm.
but I think my favorite
Mhm.
is Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts.
Yeah.
I hated them as a kid, and my dad would always say, "It's just like candy." And now finally I agree with them.
Yeah, spinach is close second. I hated both of those, broccoli and spinach, when I was younger, but now like I'll eat raw broccoli and steamed broccoli and raw spinach and everything, and I love it. And I don't know, maybe it's a sign that I'm a grown-up finally.
Well, you have planted a few seeds during this chat, Annie. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to you coming back again soon.
Yeah. Thank you again for inviting me. It's fun to talk books with you.